All right, so power and authority in the modern world, 1919 to 1946. This is a topic in HSC Modern History that's compulsory. Everyone studies it under the core study. Let's look at understanding the syllabus. First, we have the survey. We have the focus of the study, which looks at the rise of dictatorships after the World War I ended. We look at Nazi Germany from 1939 onwards, and then we look at the search for peace and security within the world. So we are going to have a look at the survey first, an overview of the peace treaties that ended World War I and their consequences. First, we are going to be discussing the initial shift towards peace in 1918. Then we will be looking at Woodrow's 14 points. We'll then be moving on to look at the armistice with Germany in November of 1918. And then we will be moving on to focus on the Treaty of Versailles. We will be especially having a look at the consequences of the Treaty of Versailles specifically. And then finally, we'll be looking at other peace treaties because the dot point clearly says peace treaties. So we don't only want to look at Versailles, and we also want to look at some of the other peace treaties. And finally, as a sixth point, we will be having a look at the consequences overall for all the treaties. So what are the sort of rough consequences of every single one of the treaties which we're going to discuss? Now, the reason that I'm sort of breaking down each syllabus dot point into a bunch of these little subpoints is because when we get questions, especially in the short answer section of the core study part of the modern history paper, we want to be looking at which part of the syllabus it links to, and then we want to have all these subpoints in mind. Because if you talk about every single one of these subpoints, you're definitely going to be achieving in that high band 5, band 6 range. Alright, so let's now start by looking at the steps towards peace that were initiated in 1918. So on the 29th of September 1918, Erich Ludendorff demanded to request a ceasefire with the Entente powers on the basis of Woodrow's 14 points. Now, we'll talk about Woodrow's 14 points soon, but the Entente powers, that's just another name for the Allies, or the Allied forces. Okay, and Woodrow's 14 points were sort of like set rules by Woodrow Wilson, who was the United States of America president at the time. Okay, now on the 5th of November 1918, the Allies agreed to take up negotiations for a truce with the added demand that Germany paid reparations. What this means is that Germany had to pay economic reparations as a result of their actions in the war. On the 29th to the 30th of October 1918, the German revolt, marking the beginning of the German Socialist Revolution. Now, this German revolt was started during the 29th to the 30th of October, where sailors in the naval port refused to take orders. Sorry. Okay, on the 9th of November 1918, the Kaiser, which is the German king, abdicated, and gave his throne to the leader of the Social Democratic Party, or the Chancellor, and at the time this person was Friedrich Ebert. Finally, on the 11th of November 1918, there was an armistice established with Germany, and this is the end, or saw to it the end, of World War I. And just to go back on the point of Erich Ludendorff, he at the time was the German army general. So he was sort of on the front line. He was seeing everything that was happening, and he sort of said to the German politicians and, well, the German leaders, hey, we need a ceasefire. We can't keep up with this. And so that's sort of how peace began to become initiated in 1918. So now moving on to Woodrow Wilson's 14 points. The 14 points called for a just peace for all parties involved in the Great War, the end of secret treaties between nations, free trade among nations, freedom of the seas, self-determination for people under colonial rule, and an international group like the League of Nations to deal with world security. Now, we'll look into this much, much later, but there wasn't a very good, no good blueprint for how the League would play out. And just to be clear, Woodrow's 14 points were important because they wanted peace for everyone. So not only peace for France, not only peace for Germany, but they wanted peace for everybody. And in case we didn't know, Woodrow Wilson was the president of the United States, which I mentioned before. All right, that's really all we need to know about the 14 points. Let's move on to the significance of the armistice with Germany. So with Berlin in the throes of revolution and the rest of the country descending into complete chaos, the deputies were obliged to agree to the terms of an armistice signed on the 11th of November 1918. This, as I mentioned before, was the day that World War I fighting stopped. So it's key to remember that on this day specifically, the logistics of sort of the end of the war hadn't been sorted out yet. This was simply a ceasefire. This is the day they said, well, that's enough fighting. But the actual logistics of this were not completed yet. And so that's where all the sort of peace treaties and stuff come in later, which we'll talk about. So I'm sure everybody's heard about this point. On the same day, at the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, the Allied powers and Germany put an end to fighting. So they signed this, and immediately on that same day, at the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, the Allied powers and Germany put an end to the fighting. The fighting had ceased. We've covered that. With the military and the imperial government refusing to take responsibility, the politicians sitting in the country's parliament, the lower house or the Reichstag, were left to negotiate peace. As a result, the new Weimar Republic, so the Weimar Republic is now the new sort of, it is Germany. Germany was referred to as the Weimar Republic for a little while, lacked legitimacy in the eyes of the militarists and right-wing supporters. And we will talk about this point. This is actually a key point in the syllabus, which is we will discuss the fall of Weimar. And this is sort of key context to understand why the Weimar sort of fell during the uprising of Hitler, which is later in the topic. And sort of the reason is because, well, the Weimar was never seen as a legitimate government. It was sort of the government that was pieced together after there was so much trouble imperially and politically in Germany. So now moving on to the Treaty of Versailles. In signing the armistice, the German delegation agreed to end the fighting based on Wilson's 14 points. So the German delegation agreed to end the fighting based on Wilson's 14 points, which were peace for everyone. Including Germany. However, when the Allies met at Versailles, it became really clear that France in particular, and sort of the representation of France at the Treaty of Versailles, was Clemenceau. So he was the person that was sort of representing France at the Treaty of Versailles, or like the Versailles Conference. And it would be a really good idea to get into the habit of calling Clemenceau the Tiger, because this is sort of what he's referred to as, because his theories or his requests for what he wanted from the treaty were really, really tough towards Germany, and so he earned himself the nickname of the Tiger. So he would settle for nothing less than the complete humiliation of Germany and a restoration of the damaged economic heartland. So the Treaty of Versailles, this is a key date. All the other dates that I mentioned, especially up here in 1918, these dates are not necessary to have memorized, but this one is a very key date that you really have to know, that the Treaty of Versailles was signed on June 28th, 1919. So this sort of marked the legitimate end to World War I. So not to say that the armistice wasn't an end to World War I. It was sort of a physical end to World War I, but this sort of solidified it politically and legally. This was the legitimate end to World War I, the Treaty of Versailles. Okay, so let's have a look at sort of the terms of Versailles. Now I'm just going to zoom in here, and we're going to have a look at some of the terms of the Treaty of Versailles. So the first one is an evacuation of all occupied territories. Next, we have the release of all prisoners of war. Next, the immediate handover of 5,000 heavy guns and 30,000 medium guns. Next, the Allies have the right to requisition property in occupied territory. And then finally, Germany had to surrender its naval fleet Germany had to restore stolen property. And finally, Germany had to accept reparations. And then finally, there was the war guilt clause, where Germany had to accept full guilt for the Great War, which is just World War I. Okay, so those were the sort of terms of Versailles, very, very summarized. Of course, Versailles was a very long document with lots and lots of terms, lots of different things, but these are sort of the main terms of the Treaty of Versailles, and main ones which you can sort of refer to in short answer responses of part 1 of the Modern History exam. Okay, so now let's move on to the Versailles Conference. We're going to look at the perspectives and aims of the USA, of France, and of Britain. So starting with Britain, we had the representative Lloyd George. And Britain was sort of the middle ground. So I'm just going to write that in red. So Lloyd George really held this perspective that although promising, to make Germany pay for the war, he realized that anything too harsh would really just cause reprisal in the future. And Lloyd George was sort of responsible for many of the compromises within the treaty. Okay, now looking at France, and they had a very destroy Germany sort of stance. And so this was Clemenceau, who, as I said, you want to be referring to as the Tiger. And his policy was that he wanted to crush Germany so that they could never stand on their feet again, nor invade France. So Clemenceau just really wanted to make sure that Germany just gets absolutely crushed. And when I say absolutely crushed, I mean economically, in terms of their military, and socially. He just wanted Germany to have completely zero legs to stand on in terms of world power. And he has a famous quote where he is sort of showing his disagreement with the USA and with Woodrow Wilson. He says that Woodrow Wilson has 14 points. God Almighty only has 10. And this is a really key quote to highlight sort of, I'm going to say Clemenceau's dissatisfaction with with the USA's sort of standpoint. And so let's talk about what that standpoint is. Of course, we know, and they were very sort of soft on Germany. And so America, of course, we know, is under Woodrow Wilson. He was the representative at the Versailles Conference. Well, he wanted peace without victory. And that's a quote from Woodrow Wilson. And so basically what this means is that he didn't care for a win. He really just cared for world peace, especially after the atrocities of World War I. As we know, he introduced America's aims with his 14 points. And of course, these were loved by the Germans, but quite ridiculed amongst other allies. And so that's really all you need to know about the Versailles Conference. You need to know sort of the different perspectives of the USA, of France, and of Britain. And you need to just know that Britain was sort of the middle ground. They wanted to make Germany pay, but they didn't want to absolutely crush them. France absolutely wanted to crush them so that they could never invade France again. And this is a good quote to refer to. And also, of course, the nickname of Clemenceau. And then Woodrow Wilson wanted peace without victory, which basically means he didn't want to win. He just really wanted peace amongst the world and amongst all nations. And that's, of course, where he introduces his 14 points, which we spoke about. Okay, so we do have other peace treaties that we want to have a look at. So we have the Treaty of Sevres, which was with Turkey, who had fought alongside Germany. We also have the Treaty of Neuilly, which is with Bulgaria, who had also fought alongside Germany. We have the Treaty of Saint-Germain, which was with Austria, who had also fought alongside Germany. And then the Treaty of Trianon with the successor state of Hungary. Now, we're not going to go into these in too much detail because honestly, I've never seen a question where they specifically ask you about one of the other treaties because there's so many, and it's really possible for there to be an absurd amount of questions they could ask you that are specific. So the types of questions you might get is maybe to discuss one other peace treaty other than the Treaty of Versailles, or maybe two treaties. But of course, as we know, the Treaty of Versailles is the main one. But it would be good to sort of look into this table. And if you'd like to know where it's from the Year 12 Modern History Excel textbook. And it's on page 10. So there's a bit more information on other treaties on page 10. So if you'd like to go have a look at those, by all means. Okay, so let's have a look at the consequences, starting with the consequences of the Treaty of Versailles, and then we'll look into the other consequences more generally of the other peace treaties and the peace treaty, like the peace process as a whole. So the Treaty of Versailles, the main consequence from this is the war guilt and humiliation. And this specifically was a German consequence. Now, what are the actual consequences of this? What's the problem with this? Well, reparations, guilt, and harsh peace were accepted by the Germans. Of course, for the German nation, this caused a hatred, which was long-lasting, towards the Allied powers. The German people felt exploited and were upset that the agreement differed so much from Wilson's 14 points. Of course, this meant that nationalists and the old ruling elite sort of teamed up against the new Weimar Republic as well as members of the old Reichstag. And so in terms of the Treaty of Versailles, the main consequences were really towards Germany. And this war guilt and humiliation consequence is a really, really big one to talk about because there's lots of stuff in here. I mean, these nationalists and old ruling elite, they actually went out and assassinated a few of the old delegates from the Reichstag who actually signed the Treaty of Versailles. We can talk about socially. what the German people felt. We can talk about economically the reparations. And so there's actually a lot to talk about in terms of the consequences for Germany simply under this war guilt and humiliation clause. Looking at consequences more nationally within Europe, there was the problem of unstable successor states. So what does this mean exactly? Well, the newly independent countries known as the successor states of Eastern Europe had great trouble establishing themselves as a democracy. And so, of course, this is a problem because now even new successor states within Europe, not only Germany, are having serious trouble establishing a sort of stable government system. And of course, that is a problem socially, economically, and politically. So an example of this is Austria, who collapsed into social and economic chaos as a result of losing most of her territory. And of course, we can see it's actually having impacts not only on Germany, but even on Austria and any of the new successor states which were sort of coming to rise within Eastern Europe. And so that really sort of concludes our conversation on consequences. We have Germany with the war guilt clause, reparations, and harsh peace. And then we can also talk about successor states, which they had trouble developing democracies, and thus social, economic, and of course political trouble. And here you can use Austria as an example. Okay, and so that's really it for the first dot point. We've covered the peace leading up to 1918. We've spoken about what Woodrow Wilson's 14 points were, the significance of the armistice with Germany, the Treaty of Versailles, the Versailles Conference and the aims of Britain, France, and the USA. We've spoken about other peace treaties, and then finally the overall consequences for Germany and other states in Europe of these peace processes.